Can you move? You're in my way. The sharp, impatient voice cut through the low murmur of passengers boarding the plane, instantly grabbing everyone's attention. A few people turned their heads, curious to see who was causing a scene so early in the flight. Standing in the aisle was a white woman in her mid-40s, wearing oversized sunglasses even though they were inside, and holding a designer handbag like it was worth more than everyone's luggage combined. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and diamond earrings screamed money and entitlement. The man she was talking to was tall, well-dressed and composed, a black man in a crisp navy blue suit, holding a boarding pass and a calm expression. Without saying a word, he stepped aside and let her through. "Thank you," he said quietly, his tone respectful but distant. He wasn't interested in confrontation. He just wanted to get to his seat and enjoy the flight. The woman barely acknowledged him, brushing past with an irritated huff, as if his mere presence had somehow inconvenienced her. People nearby exchanged awkward looks, but no one said anything. It was one of those moments that made everyone uncomfortable. But most passengers preferred to stay silent rather than get involved. The man's name was Marcus. He wasn't new to this kind of behavior. Throughout his life, he had learned that silence sometimes spoke louder than words. When people tried to provoke him, his calmness usually disarmed them. It wasn't weakness. It was strength, quiet and deliberate. As Marcus reached his assigned seat, he noticed something that made him exhale softly in disbelief. His seat, 2A first class, and was right next to hers. The same woman who had just barked at him was now looking at her ticket, then back at him with a look of disgust. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear. "There must be some mistake." Marcus gave a polite half-smile. "No mistake, ma'am. This is 2A, her lips tightened. "You're sitting here? In first class?" He nodded calmly. "Yes, ma'am. That's what my ticket says." The woman crossed her arms, clearly offended by the idea. "I paid for first class because I expected a certain standard," she said, her tone dripping with superiority. "Not to sit next to—" She stopped herself, realizing how that sentence might sound out loud. But the pause said everything. Marcus simply placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, ignoring the judgment in her tone. The flight attendant approached, sensing tension. "Is everything okay here?" she asked politely. Karen, as Marcus later overheard her name, plastered on a fake smile. "Oh, everything's fine," she said sweetly, then lowered her voice. "But are you sure this man belongs in first class? Maybe there's been a mix-up." The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard. "No, ma'am. Mr. Reed is on our manifest for seat 2A. Karen forced a laugh, pretending it was all a misunderstanding. Right. Just checking." She sat down stiffly, turning her body slightly away from Marcus as if sharing space with him was somehow beneath her. Marcus adjusted his seatbelt and opened a book, pretending not to notice the subtle sneer on her face. But deep down he felt that familiar sting, not of anger but disappointment. It was 2025, and yet here he was, still facing the same quiet prejudice he'd encountered since he was a kid. The plane filled quickly, the soft hum of engines growing louder as passengers settled in. But in their row, the air felt colder. Karen huffed every few minutes, checking her phone, adjusting her scarf, sighing dramatically as though to remind everyone that she was displeased. When the flight attendant came around to offer pre-flight drinks, Karen waved her off impatiently. "I'll wait until we take off," she said. Then, with a pointed glance at Marcus, she added, "I just don't want to spill anything." Marcus knew exactly what she meant, that she didn't trust sitting too close to him. He looked out the window, his jaw tightening slightly, but he didn't react. He'd spent years learning to control his emotions in moments like this. Still, inside, he couldn't help but think how absurd it was. He'd worked hard his entire life, through college, through long nights in the office, through years of proving himself in rooms where he was often the only black man present. And yet, to her, he was just another stranger who didn't belong in the seat beside her. The flight attendants prepared for takeoff. The captain's voice came over the speaker, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Skyjet Airlines. We'll be departing shortly for New York City. Please fasten your seatbelts and enjoy your flight." As the plane began to move, Marcus took a deep breath. He reminded himself not to let ignorance ruin his peace. The woman beside him could think whatever she wanted. He knew exactly who he was, and nothing she said or implied could change that. But as fate would have it, this wouldn't just be another uncomfortable flight. This journey would soon turn into something far more revealing, a lesson that would remind everyone watching that true class isn't measured by money, clothes, or seat numbers, but by character. And before the plane landed, the woman who thought she was better than him would learn that the hard way. As the plane climbed steadily into the clouds, the tension between Marcus and Karen thickened like heavy air before a storm. The rest of the passengers seemed to settle in peacefully, reading, sleeping, or watching movies, but not Karen. She kept shifting in her seat, sighing loudly, glancing toward Marcus with looks that carried more judgment than words ever could. Every few minutes, she made a small scene. When Marcus adjusted his armrest, she jerked her arm away and muttered, "Unbelievable." When he reached for his bag under the seat, she flinched slightly, as if his movement somehow invaded her space. It was subtle, but cruel, the kind of quiet hostility that comes not from fear, but from prejudice wrapped in fake politeness. Marcus ignored her, pretending to be lost in his book, but he could feel her eyes burning into him. He wasn't a stranger to this behavior. He had seen it before, on trains, in restaurants, in boardrooms. It was the kind of attitude that said, "I don't hate you, I just think you don't belong here." The flight attendant returned to offer beverages. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" she asked with a polite smile. Karen crossed her legs dramatically and said, "Yes, I'll take a sparkling water. But could you please make sure the glass is clean? Last time I caught lipstick on mine. Disgusting." The attendant nodded, unfazed. "Of course, ma'am." "And for you, sir?" Marcus smiled softly. "Just water, please." As the attendant poured the drinks, Karen leaned slightly toward her, lowering her voice but loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Can I get a new glass? I don't want to use one from the same tray as his. I have sensitivities." The words landed like stones. The attendant froze for a second, realizing what was being implied. Marcus didn't move. He just looked straight ahead, eyes fixed on the seat in front of him, his jaw clenched. The attendant took a slow breath and said firmly, "All our glasses are clean, ma'am. Everyone served equally." She handed Marcus his drink, then Karen's, before walking away. Her expression caught somewhere between discomfort and quiet disapproval. Karen scoffed. "Well, that was rude," she muttered. "Customer service isn't what it used to be." Marcus put down his glass and turned slightly toward her. His voice was calm but heavy with meaning. "You know, it's possible to be classy without being cruel." Her head snapped toward him. "Excuse me?" He met her eyes without flinching. "You don't need to look down on people to feel superior." Karen blinked, taken aback that he dared to respond. Her tone sharpened. "Oh, please. Don't act like I'm the bad guy here. I didn't say anything racist. I just expect a certain standard when I pay for first class." "A standard of what?" Marcus asked quietly. She hesitated, fumbling for words. "Of professionalism, cleanliness, standards." He nodded slowly. "Interesting definition." Then he turned back to his book, dismissing her without another glance. Her face flushed red. She hated being ignored. She leaned closer again, whispering with a fake smile, "You must be new to this kind of travel, huh? Don't worry, and you'll get used to it. Maybe someday you'll even earn a real seat here instead of an upgrade." Marcus said nothing, but his silence carried more weight than an argument ever could. He'd learned long ago that arguing with ignorance only gave it oxygen. Still, the nearby passengers noticed. A man across the aisle frowned disapprovingly. A younger woman a few rows up whispered to her friend, "Did she really just say that?" But no one intervened, not yet. People rarely did until it was too late. Karen, sensing the stares, pulled out her phone and began scrolling dramatically, pretending to be too busy to care. Every so often she let out another exaggerated sigh, like she was the victim of some great injustice. The hours passed slowly. The flight attendants continued serving meals, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and most people began to relax. But not Marcus. Not with Karen beside him. He could feel her presence, a mix of perfume, arrogance, and hostility. When dinner service came around, the attendant asked, "Chicken or pasta, sir?" "I'll take the chicken," Marcus replied. Karen immediately interjected, "Make sure mine is served first. I'm hungry." and I've been waiting." The attendant, maintaining her professional tone, nodded and served Marcus first, simply because he was seated closer. Karen's face tightened. "Wow, I guess some people get special treatment now," she muttered bitterly. Marcus placed his napkin neatly on his lap and finally looked at her. His tone was even. "Some people don't need to be loud to be respected." That sentence hit her harder than she expected. For a brief moment, she said nothing. She turned her face toward the window, glaring at the reflection staring back at her. One she didn't entirely like. But Karen wasn't the type to back down. "Not yet." She took a sip of her wine and said under her breath, "People like you are always so sensitive. Can't even take a joke." Marcus tilted his head slightly, giving her a look that made her words crumble. "Ma'am," he said softly, "there's a difference between a joke and an insult. One makes people laugh. The other exposes who you are." For the first time, Karen had no comeback. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She turned back to her meal, suddenly quiet. The rest of the cabin seemed to exhale, as though everyone had been holding their breath. Marcus went back to his book unfazed. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them, and Karen, for once, had nothing to say. But deep inside, she still burned with embarrassment. And what she didn't yet know was that before the plane touched down, that quiet man beside her, the one she'd mocked, insulted, and underestimated, would turn out to be someone she'd regret ever crossing. The turbulence came out of nowhere. One moment the plane was gliding smoothly above the clouds, and the next it jolted sharply, sending a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Drinks rattled, overhead bins shook, and Karen let out a startled yelp, grabbing the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Marcus, who had been quietly reading a document on his laptop, looked up calmly. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're hitting a patch of turbulence, but everything is under control." Karen's eyes darted around in panic. Her chest rose and fell quickly as she whispered, "Oh my God. Oh my God, we're going down." Marcus turned to her, his voice steady and reassuring. "We're not going down, ma'am. It's just turbulence. Happens on almost every flight." She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, as if suddenly forgetting all the disdain she'd shown before. "You sound so calm. How can you be so calm right now?" "Because I've been through this before," Marcus replied gently. "Planes are built to handle much worse than this. Just breathe, in and out. You're safe." Karen nodded shakily, following his instructions. For a moment, the arrogance that had coated her voice earlier was gone. She looked vulnerable, even human. Marcus continued speaking softly, explaining how air pockets and wind currents caused the bumps. The steady rhythm of his voice seemed to calm her down. As the plane steadied, she let out a shaky laugh. "You must think I'm ridiculous," she said, brushing her hair away from her face. "Not at all," Marcus said kindly. "Most people don't like turbulence. Fear's natural." She hesitated, glancing at him. "You really do sound like you've done this a lot." "I have," he replied. "Flying's part of my job. I'm in the air at least once a week." Her curiosity flickered. "Really? What kind of job has you flying that often?" "You don't seem like the typical business traveler." Marcus smiled faintly. "I guess I'm not typical." Karen tilted her head, intrigued but still defensive. "So what do you do then? Motivational speaker? Music producer?" He chuckled softly. "No, nothing like that. Let's just say I work with a lot of people who make sure flights like this stay safe and comfortable." Karen's brows furrowed slightly. But before she could ask more, the attendant passed by to check seatbelts. The turbulence had faded, and the cabin lights were dimmed again. Karen sighed deeply, the tension in her shoulders loosening. For the next half hour, something strange happened. She started talking like a normal person. The sharpness in her voice softened. She shared little details about her life, how she worked in marketing, how she often traveled for business, how she hated flying, but loved being treated like she was important. Marcus listened patiently, nodding here and there, occasionally smiling at her jokes, though they often came wrapped in subtle arrogance. Still, beneath her words, he could sense something: insecurity. Her need to feel above others didn't come from strength. It came from fear. People like her often wore superiority as armor, afraid that without it they'd be seen as small. So, Karen said eventually, swirling the last of her wine, you said you fly every week. Do you ever get tired of it? Sometimes, Marcus admitted. But I love what I do. It's about making sure people feel safe, respected, and cared for. Whether they're sitting in first class or the last row, Karen smirked. Well, that's nice. But you don't really think people are equal on a plane, do you? I mean, come on. First class exists for a reason. Marcus looked at her, his eyes steady but kind. Maybe, but money buys a seat, not manners. The words landed softly but cut deep. Karen froze for a second, then laughed nervously. You're surprisingly philosophical for someone who works in aviation or whatever it is you do. I've seen enough people in the sky, Marcus said, closing his laptop. Up here, titles don't matter much. When turbulence hits, everyone grips the same armrest. Karen went quiet. She didn't admit it, but that line struck her. There was something about the way he spoke, calm, confident, but humble, that didn't match her assumption of him earlier. She had pegged him as an ordinary man, maybe someone who had lucked into a first-class upgrade. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that Marcus wasn't ordinary at all. After a moment, she sighed. You know, you're not like I thought you'd be. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And how did you think I'd be? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I don't know. Defensive, maybe. Angry. Most people would have snapped at me by now, he smiled faintly. Anger's easy. Grace takes practice. That response silenced her again. She turned toward the window, watching the moonlight glint off the clouds. There was something deeply unsettling and humbling about being shown kindness by someone she had disrespected. As the hours passed, she spoke less and listened more. Marcus, meanwhile, went back to his quiet reading, sipping his water slowly, unbothered and at peace. For the first time, Karen found herself wondering about him, who he really was, what kind of job he did, and why he seemed so composed. But she didn't ask again. Maybe she was afraid of what she'd learn, because deep down, a small voice inside her whispered that this man, the one she'd insulted, mocked, and tried to belittle, might not just be another passenger, and she was right. By the time the plane touched the ground, she would discover the truth. And it would leave her wishing she could take back every cruel word she'd said. The plane began its slow descent toward the city lights below, the faint hum of the engines blending with the crackle of the captain's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for arrival. Karen stretched, fixing her hair and lipstick with the reflection from her phone camera. She was ready to be back on solid ground, ready to leave behind what she thought had been a long, uncomfortable flight, beside a man she had misjudged from the start, though she'd never admit it. Marcus sat quietly beside her, closing his laptop and placing it neatly in his bag. His calmness hadn't wavered once throughout the entire flight, and that, more than anything, made her uneasy. The plane began gliding lower, and the city lights sparkled beneath the wings like a sea of diamonds. Karen adjusted her scarf and glanced sideways at Marcus. Well, she said, forcing a smile, it's been interesting sitting next to you. Marcus smiled faintly. Interesting is one word for it. She let out a small, awkward laugh. You know, I didn't mean anything by earlier. Before she could finish, a familiar chime echoed through the cabin. The intercom clicked again, but this time the captain's voice sounded different, warmer, more personal. Ladies and gentlemen, before we land, I'd like to take a brief moment to recognize someone special on board today. We have with us Mr. Marcus Reed, the newly appointed Vice President of Skyjet Airlines. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Passengers turned to look, whispering his name as if confirming they'd heard correctly. Even the flight attendants who had been buckled in for landing smiled and clapped quietly. Karen froze. Her hand stopped mid-adjustment of her scarf. Her eyes widened as she turned to look at Marcus, who sat still, smiling politely but humbly, giving a small nod to acknowledge the recognition. The captain continued. We're honored to have Mr. Reed with us on this flight. He's been instrumental in improving passenger safety and service standards across all our routes. Thank you for flying with us, sir. Karen's mouth fell open slightly. You're the vice president? she stammered, her voice trembling between disbelief and embarrassment. Marcus turned his head toward her and nodded once. That's right. Her heart sank. Every insult, every snide comment, every dismissive glance replayed in her mind like a cruel highlight reel. She remembered telling the flight attendant that Marcus didn't belong in first class. She remembered questioning whether he could afford the seat. And now she realized the truth. He wasn't just a passenger who belonged there. He was one of the people who ran the airline. I didn't know, she said quickly, her voice small. I swear I didn't know who you were. Marcus's tone was calm, but there was a quiet weight in his words. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect. Karen looked down, her cheeks flushing crimson. You're right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I was rude. And stupid. I'm so sorry. He gave a gentle, understanding smile. I appreciate that, but it's not about me, ma'am. It's about how we treat people when we think no one's watching, when we think it doesn't matter. She blinked hard, swallowing a lump in her throat. For the first time in a long while, she had no comeback, no defensive joke, no shield of arrogance to hide behind. The truth hit her harder than any turbulence ever could. The flight attendant came by one last time to thank Marcus personally. It's such an honor having you on board, sir. We've all heard about your new role. Congratulations. Marcus nodded graciously. Thank you. You all did a great job today, especially handling difficult passengers with patience. The attendant smiled knowingly and glanced briefly at Karen before walking away. Karen sank into her seat, wishing the plane would land faster so she could disappear into the crowd. When the wheels touched down, the cabin filled with the sounds of applause and seatbelts clicking open. Karen stayed still, unable to move. As Marcus stood to retrieve his bag, she looked up at him nervously. Mr. Reed, she said softly, please, I really didn't mean to be so horrible. I was having a bad day and I took it out on you. I'm ashamed of myself. Marcus looked down at her for a moment, his eyes kind but firm. I understand. We all have bad days, but bad days don't excuse bad behavior. You don't have to be perfect, just human. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. I'll remember that, she said quietly. He nodded once more. Good. Then maybe this flight was worth something after all. As he turned to leave, passengers made way for him respectfully. The same people who had stayed silent when Karen belittled him earlier now smiled at him, offering nods of acknowledgement. He moved with quiet dignity, his presence commanding admiration without effort. Karen sat frozen in her seat, watching him disappear down the aisle. The sound of his calm footsteps echoed in her head long after he was gone. For the first time, she saw herself clearly, not as the sophisticated woman she thought she was, but as someone who had let prejudice blind her to decency. Outside, as the plane doors opened and fresh air rushed in, Marcus walked through the terminal surrounded by ordinary travelers. No bodyguards, no spotlight, just quiet confidence. To him, it had been just another flight. To Karen, it had been a mirror reflecting everything she needed to change. She stayed seated long after the last passenger left, staring out the small oval window. The city lights below didn't look so bright anymore. They looked distant, unreachable, like something she had lost without even realizing it. And in that silent moment, she understood. The man she had tried to humiliate had given her something far more valuable than judgment. He had given her perspective, and a lesson she would never forget. Karen sat frozen in her seat long after the plane had landed, her reflection trembling faintly against the darkened window. Passengers were already standing, pulling down bags, chatting excitedly about the surprise announcement they'd just heard. But she couldn't move. Her hands rested uselessly in her lap, her throat tight with shame. She had humiliated a man who turned out to be one of the most powerful figures in the company she'd bragged about, paying good money to fly with. But it wasn't just embarrassment that burned inside her now. It was regret. Deep, uncomfortable regret that no apology could fully erase. Marcus was standing now, his bag slung over his shoulder, ready to leave. The aisle had cleared for him, people nodding respectfully as he walked past. There was a quiet authority in his stride. Not arrogance, not superiority, but self-assured dignity. He looked like a man who knew his worth long before anyone else did. Karen finally found her voice. Mr. Reed, she called out softly, her words almost trembling. He turned back slightly, waiting, She rose from her seat, fumbling with her scarf, unable to meet his gaze at first. I wanted to say I'm sorry, truly, for everything I said and how I acted. I had no right. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, not with anger, but with something far more powerful. Calm understanding. Apology accepted, he said quietly. But remember, respect shouldn't depend on someone's title or paycheck. It should be the default, for everyone. Karen nodded, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. You're right, she whispered. I was wrong, I guess. I just thought being in first class meant something. It does, Marcus said gently. But it's not about comfort or luxury. It's about character. How you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you. That's what really defines class. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by her own emotions. I'll remember that, she said. Marcus gave her a small, forgiving smile. Then this flight wasn't a waste of time after all. He nodded once and continued toward the exit. As he disappeared through the cabin doors, Karen sank back into her seat again. Around her, people whispered excitedly, some about the turbulence, others about the surprise announcement, but all about the man who had just walked off the plane. The man she had mocked and dismissed. Her heart ached. She thought about how she had acted, the sneers, the insults, the way she questioned whether he belonged in first class. She had treated him like a stranger unworthy of her respect, all because of his skin color and her shallow assumptions. And the cruelest part? She had done it without even realizing how ugly it made her look. As the plane slowly emptied, one of the flight attendants approached, pausing beside Karen. Ma'am, she said softly, I'll need to ask you to gather your things so we can prepare for the next flight. Karen nodded quickly, trying to compose herself. Of course. I'm sorry, the attendant hesitated, then added, for what it's worth. He wasn't upset. He just smiled and said, People learn when they're ready to. Karen's eyes widened slightly. He said that? Yes, the attendant said, giving her a small smile. You're lucky. Most people wouldn't have handled it with that much grace. When Karen finally stepped out of the plane, the airport felt colder than usual. People bustled past with luggage and coffee cups, all of them going about their lives. But she moved slower, her thoughts heavy and raw. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's calm face, the look of quiet strength that needed no defense. Outside the terminal, the air was crisp and bright. Planes roared in the distance, taking off into the morning sky. Karen stopped near a window, watching one lift into the clouds. She thought about what he'd said. Respect shouldn't depend on someone's title. The words echoed in her mind like a lesson carved into stone. For years, she had believed success was about appearance. The clothes, the status, the seat number on a plane. But today, a single encounter had stripped away that illusion. She realized that true success had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with humanity. Kindness, humility, and empathy. She thought about all the people she had looked down on without reason, the waiters she ignored, the hotel staff she barely thanked, the security guards she brushed off. It all came rushing back, every little moment of arrogance now feeling like a scar she had never noticed before. Karen walked toward the exit, her heels clicking softly on the tile floor. For once she didn't feel powerful. She felt small, but in the best way, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. She stopped at a cafe just outside the terminal and ordered a coffee. When the barista handed it to her, she smiled genuinely and said, "Thank you. I appreciate it." It was a small gesture, but it was the first step toward being better. As she sat near the window, watching planes come and go, she whispered to herself, "Everyone deserves respect. Everyone." Somewhere across the terminal, Marcus was walking through the VIP corridor, his phone buzzing with congratulatory messages from colleagues. He glanced at one text and smiled faintly, but his thoughts drifted back to the woman on the plane. He hoped she had learned something, not for his sake, but for hers, because he knew from experience that real change doesn't happen when someone gets punished. It happens when they see themselves clearly, when the mirror of their actions forces them to confront who they've become. And as the sound of another plane taking off filled the air, Karen looked up and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Reed." She knew he'd never hear it, but that didn't matter. The apology wasn't for him anymore. It was for the person she wanted to become. That day, a short flight had turned into a lifelong journey, one that would change how she looked at people forever.